We are going to ask the candidates to dive into an issue that you heard referenced several times when they talked about priorities, and that is climate. And specifically, the question that we have asked them to answer is, what can the city do to meaningfully reduce our greenhouse gas footprint? And we're going to start with the candidates for position 6 and ask George Kramer to start us off.
Okay. The city has adopted a couple of policies, the SEEP policy and the 10 by 20 policy, that address climate change and reducing our carbon footprint. And I support those, especially the SEEP program, because of its gestation with ASHLAND's children. On the 10 by 20 plan, I tend to be suspicious and doubtful about large-scale multi-million-dollar solar arrays on the Imperatus property. I tend to remember the old E.F. Schumacher book, Small is Beautiful, and think about what we can do that isn't a $10 million project. And I would look at distributed solar. Maybe we sell the Imperatus property and use those funds to put smaller solar arrays on existing city properties. But more importantly, again, we're a town of 21,000, and while reducing our carbon footprint is important, probably the most meaningful way we can do that is to reduce the use of private vehicles, gas-consuming vehicles, and to me that's a planning issue. We should be looking at land use planning changes that allow people the option of walking to buy a carton of milk or a cup of coffee or to get a haircut. And by changing the way we develop a city, we're here with the Mountain Meadows Democrats. It's always amazed me that when Mountain Meadows was built, you had to drive 3 miles into Safeway to buy a carton of milk. It seemed like it would be a lot more logical to have small little neighborhood centers, commercial centers, that would encourage people to walk, encourage people to get out of their car. And the side benefit of that, aside from the health of walking or biking, is that maybe they would meet their neighbors and maybe they would talk over the fence. That's how I think we can meaningfully and realistically address climate change and greenhouse gases in Ashland. Thank you.
Steve Jensen.
So I served on the Ashland Forest Lands Commission and 3 or 4 years as chair, and was one of the primary editors of the nationally recognized Ashland Fire Plan. It's a deeply technical document that we developed in-house and saved the city a bunch of outside contract money. There's a chapter in there called Climate Change, Global Yet Local. So here's a little dilemma in the watershed. One of the primary goals is to protect our water source and to prevent a catastrophic forest fire. In order to do that, we have to bring the forest back to health, an overgrown forest, by fuels reduction. The way we do fuels reduction is by thinning, piling, and burning. All right? So the burning gives us 2 things. It gives us smoke, but measured amounts of smoke, which is generally tolerable, and we might as well start getting used to it. But it also does what? It releases CO2 into the air. So that's our dilemma. The other dilemma is, as we reduce those fuels, the carbon sequestration that was tied up in that overgrown forest is also released. So the dilemma here is that the correct thing to do to prevent the catastrophic wildfires, not in our watershed, but like the ones that we saw this summer? It's a little bit of an existential dilemma. I would agree with George about the large mega projects on solar arrays. While it's a feel-good project and sounds tenable, financially it's a real stretch. And I would really challenge the candidate who said that we could be 100% with renewable energy in a very short period of time. That is a bridge way too far. I think we have to be realistic in this town about our response to carbon emissions. Thank you.
And we'll move to the candidates for position 2, Tanya Graham.
Addressing the climate crisis has to be at the very top of Ashland's list of priorities, because it needs to be at the top of every community's list of priorities. The International Panel on Climate Change just this week released a special report downgrading the level of global warming down from 2 degrees Celsius to 1.5 degrees Celsius before we hit catastrophic impacts. Once we tip this system, we can't get it back. And so what this means is that communities across the country, especially since the Trump administration has abdicated its responsibility, the leadership has to start at the city. And what that means is we have to do a couple of things. We need to conserve energy wherever we can. We need to transition away from burning fossil fuels and towards electricity. And then we need to meet that electrical demand by developing local renewable resources, of energy resources. And when we do that, the beauty of that is that those processes and those projects, they create family wage jobs, and that money stays in the community. We need to do this urgently. What we've done as a community so far in response to a lot of citizen activity and activism is create a solid set of targets, but we're not moving fast enough to meet them. And so what we need to do is, we right now have an ad hoc committee process that's working on implementing the Climate and Energy Action Plan. What we need is a task force. And that task force needs to include not only city government, but also the business community. It needs to include local civic organizations. It needs to include the university and the school district. We all need to come together to figure out what are our individual pieces of this climate change puzzle, and then set about the task of getting those pieces done.
Mike Morris?
Okay. So, when the Climate Energy Action Plan came to the council, it was kind of interesting because I somewhat joked that we could do this 8% really easy. Just no one use natural gas and no one drive their kids to school. And it didn't go over very well. People still want to use those things. Natural gas gets cheaper and cheaper, and driving is pretty simple. And so personally, I think we need some type of a mindset of how we look at this. The SEEP plan incorporates a lot of changes, what the city can do, what we do for purchase goods. And in reality, there's not a lot of impact that the city as an entity, the city of Ashland, can change. So it's up to us. It's up to everyone in this room. It's not up to someone else to do it for us. I think it's really an issue that we need to look at and work with that SEEP committee and figure out what steps we would be willing to take. If we're not willing to take any, I think we're done. And we wouldn't need to reinvest in the community. But I think we honestly, it's up to each one of us as an individual to see what we can do and how we can help the process to make it easier for the community to meet the 8% reductions every year, and maybe possibly even 10 or 12%.